You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie in the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast.
That's right. And before we get into today's topic, we'd like to give a huge shout out to our newest Patreon members, Jack Luo. And this is a new one for me, and I'm personally a fan of this name. Thank you, Jim the Adequate, for your very kind donation. Thank you so much. We really, really sincerely, honestly could not keep doing this without the support of our patrons, and we're so grateful. And if you want to know more about different ways to support our little independent podcast, please listen until the end, because that's when we'll tell you some more about that and some info on our next Patreon get-together, because now it is time to jump right into a topic that we know is going to be up your creepy dark alley.
This and next week, we will be talking about a very rare phenomenon in the true crime world, a serial killer family. I think it's already rather rare to have a serial killer duo working together, like friends or a couple, the Wests or something like this. But a whole family?
Yeah, it's too many killers together.
Yeah. I can't think of a lot of cases like that, at least not in the real world. I mean, I know it's often used in horror movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for example.
This story is like a horror movie. I'm always like, did this happen? If there was ever a family photo, like if you ever were going to look up who are these people in the dictionary, it would be a photograph of these people. It's not good.
No, it's not. And of course, we are referring to the Bender family, also known as the Bloody Benders, which is a fitting name.
Yeah.
And for this, we have to travel back over 150 years to Kansas, back then still considered the Western frontier. Everyone who listens to us regularly knows that this time and place in history is one of my special interests.
It is. You love it.
Kansas was the 34th state to join the United States. It was admitted to the Union on 29th of January 1861 under the Wyandotte Constitution as a free state shortly before the outbreak of the American Civil War. But of course, there is so much more history and interesting facts when it comes to Kansas, and I honestly don't remember how much we talked about the history of Kansas when we covered the Clutter murders that also took place in Kansas. I think the history of Kansas is somewhat interesting for this episode though, so let's take a super quick look at it, shall we? Long before Kansas became part of the United States, it was home to nomadic Native American tribes who relied on the vast herds of bison that roamed the Great Plains. Around 1450 AD, the Wichita people founded Etzanoa, which was a sprawling city near present-day Arkansas City. At its peak, Etzanoa might have been home to 20,000 people, and it was a big hub of life and culture. However, by 1700, the city was practically abandoned, and I don't think it's very clear what happened to it.
I did see there's a, I didn't have time to watch it, but I did see a thing on visiting the Etzanoa settlement. Like you can visit the archaeological, I think that's a thing. So check it out if like us, that sort of thing interests you. I need to look more into it.
European exploration began in the 16th century when the Spanish conquistadores like Francisco Vázquez de Coronado ventured into Kansas, which I also find interesting and might surprise many people because I think when you think of the Spanish conquistadores, you think of Central America or Florida or these kind of places, but not Kansas, right?
Yeah, I think we often, as an American, I often imagine them as just sort of reaching the shoreline of a place, ruining it, and then going home again with the riches. Is kind of how I imagine all of those encounters. But it's incredibly daunting to think about crossing over and then venturing that far into the continent.
Wasn't that also in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Wasn't it Coronado?
Probably. I think we talk about him in the St. Augustine episode.
Yeah. So his expedition in 1541 marked the first recorded meeting between Europeans and the ancestors of the Wichita people. The introduction of horses brought by the Spanish revolutionized the lifestyle of the Plains tribes, transforming them into the nomadic buffalo hunters often associated with Native American culture. Now, fast forward to 1803, when Kansas became part of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase. For decades, the region was considered part of the Great American Desert, seen as unfit for settlement and largely reserved for Native American tribes displaced by U.S. policies. This began to change in 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened Kansas to settlement and triggered a contentious debate over whether it would allow slavery. What followed was a very bloody chapter in Kansas history known as Bleeding Kansas. Settlers from the north and the south rushed into the territory hoping to sway the vote on slavery either way. This led to violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, including the infamous events like the Pottawatomie Massacre, led by abolitionist John Brown. This conflict became somewhat of a prelude to the American Civil War. And as I already mentioned before, Kansas entered the Union as a free state on 29th of January 1861, so shortly before the start of the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, Kansas was right on the border, sharing a very tense boundary with pro-slavery Missouri. Throughout the war, Kansas suffered frequent guerrilla raids, the worst being Quantrill's raid on Lawrence in 1863. I'm pretty sure we also talked about Quantrill's raid already. I don't remember in what episode.
Yeah.
The Confederates led by William Quantrill attacked the abolitionist town, killing over 150 men and boys and burning most buildings to the ground. And despite all of this, despite all the attacks and all the dangers, Kansas committed fully to the Union cause, even exceeding its troop quotas.
Go Kansas.
Tragically, Kansas regiment suffered some of the highest casualty rates in the war, not only from battle but from disease and the relentless violence of warfare. By the way, I'm sure we mentioned this before. Again, we mentioned so many things over the years. But here's an interesting fact for you. During the American Civil War, disease was a leading cause of death among Union soldiers. Not only Union soldiers, but I have the numbers here. Approximately 2/3 of Union soldier deaths were due to disease, while only about 1/3 resulted from battle injuries or wounds sustained in combat. Which means, in absolute numbers, out of approximately 360,000 Union soldier deaths, around 245,000 died from disease, while about 115,000 died from battle-related causes. This is not unusual. This high percentage of soldiers dying from disease was somewhat the norm in war up until World War I, actually.
Yeah, and not just in the United States. As anyone familiar with Florence Nightingale's story knows, she revolutionized nursing due to this very problem during the Crimean War. A fun fact about her is that she wasn't just a pioneer of modern nursing, but in 1858, she was the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society. This is because she explained in a diagram that is now known as the Rose diagram that the majority of the deaths recorded in these army hospitals were, as Johanna was just saying, not because of warfare, but because of all of the disease. And she, obviously preached that these were things that could be controlled with nutrition and ventilation and shelter. I just read this article about her being a statistician, which is how I know that, and I thought it was interesting. So, back to Kansas.
Yeah. So, the war left Kansas economically strained, but it solidified the state's identity as a beacon of abolition and perseverance. It was a turbulent, violent chapter, but it marked Kansas as one of the key players in the fight for freedom in America. The post-Civil War period brought also new opportunities and challenges. Kansas became a destination for cattle drives from Texas, with towns like Abilene and Dodge City emerging as very important hubs of the cattle trade. This era also gave rise to legendary figures of the Wild West, such as Wild Bill Hickok. These are names that became synonymous with Kansas and general lawless frontier days. By the way, speaking of Wild Bill Hickok, I'm still planning on doing an episode, or probably more than one episodes, about Deadwood, because that's where Wild Bill Hickok died with the dead man's hand during poker playing. Yeah.
I'd like to hear that one.
In the late 19th century, Kansas also played a significant role in the fight for racial equality. Following the Civil War, thousands of freed African Americans known as exodusters migrated to Kansas seeking better opportunities and freedom from the oppressive conditions in the South. And they founded settlements like Nicodemus, for example, which was close to the border to Nebraska. And apparently, I looked it up, there are still 14 people living in Nicodemus. And if you want to learn more about the place, you can either visit the place or you can visit one of Annie's favorite sources, which is the National Park Service webpage, the nps.gov.
I love you, National Park Service.
Yeah, it's so good. So much information. So much.
So good. So well categorized. It's just another reason to love the national parks.
Also interesting, Kansas history also intersects with major movements like the temperance and the prohibition. In 1881, it became the first state to amend its constitution to prohibit alcohol, a stance it maintained until 1948. And even then, restrictions persisted, and public bars weren't legal until 1987.
That's wild.
Today, Kansas is often seen as the heartland of America, but its history is anything but simple. We're not even going into the whole Dust Bowl era and how devastating that period was, because our story takes place in 1870.
When we hear Wild West today, many people probably think of Texas or maybe New Mexico, Arizona, but I think few people, including myself, would think of Kansas. But in the 1870s, Kansas, together with Montana, South and North Dakota, as well as Nebraska, it was truly the Wild West, a place where the frontier spirit met the realities of settlement. The Civil War had ended, Kansas was still a young state, and people were streaming in, eager to make their fortune, or maybe just survive. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised free land to those brave enough to claim and farm it, and claim that they did, setting up homesteads across the state, though many would face hardship, isolation, and the constant threat of drought. Johanna already said it, one of the major developments in Kansas in the 1870s was the rise of cattle towns. After the Civil War, cattle ranching boomed in Texas, but without direct rail lines, ranchers needed a way to get their cattle to the market. Kansas became that link. Ranchers drove herds north along trails like the Chisholm Trail to railhead towns in Kansas, where cattle could be shipped to markets in the east. Abilene was one of the first big cattle towns, and others like Dodge City and Ellsworth soon followed. And we all know what happens when a bunch of rough people end up in a place with almost no law. You end up in a rather rough place. Yeah, that's... no thanks. These cattle towns quickly earned their reputation as being rowdy and lawless. Cowboys looking to unwind after months on the trail would fill saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. And that is what drew in lawmen and gunslingers, and many criminals, and also some great people just looking for a good time, who can say. But what better place for a whole family of murderers? The Bender family, that's Father John and his wife Elvira, with their son John Jr. and their daughter Kate, arrived in Labette County, Kansas, around 1869 or 1870, right during the peak of frontier settlement. They weren't just moving to Kansas on a whim. They, too, had been enticed by the Homestead Act of 1862, offering anyone willing to farm the land a tempting deal, 160 acres of public land, essentially for free, as long as you could stick it out for 5 years. For many, it was a chance to start fresh. For others, like the Benders, it provided a unique opportunity. Well, actually, the first to arrive was John Jr., who had traveled ahead to look for a piece of land for him and his family to settle on. Once he found the right spot, he sent a letter to Illinois, informing his parents and sister to come join him there. The Benders claimed a homestead right along the Osage Trail, which was busy with travelers heading west. So who exactly were the Benders? The family was an unusual group, even for the frontier. Let's start with John Bender Sr., the supposed patriarch. He was described as a big, gruff man who spoke very little English, and when he did, it was almost unintelligible. People who met him described him as intimidating, not the friendly innkeeper you'd hope for in such a remote place. Then there was Elvira Bender, allegedly John Sr.'s wife. She was just as unsettling, let's just say. Locals called her She-Devil behind her back, which is not exactly a term of endearment. She was known to be rude and hostile, especially toward children, which was strange in a tight-knit community. It's still frowned upon today. Fun fact. If you're hostile toward children, even if they have it coming, no one appreciates it. She claimed to have a special healing ability, although she mostly just scared people off. Then we have John Bender Jr. He was supposedly their son, but rumors suggested otherwise. He was younger, spoke fluent English, and had much different manner. People in town thought he was mentally unstable, and some even described him as feeble-minded. Their words. He'd laugh at odd moments, and he struggled to interact in normal society. He was eccentric, to put it mildly.
Back in those days, you were allowed to be eccentric if you were rich and powerful, but not... I mean, it's still like this today, but now we're starting to understand more how neurodivergent people think.
Exactly.
How they interact.
I was just going to say, he just sounds very neurodivergent, which...
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. But like you said, we know more about that today than back then. The last member of the family was Kate. Kate was young, attractive, and the most sociable member of the family. She claimed to be a spiritualist and a healer, advertising herself as a psychic who could commune with spirits. We talked at length about this in the Fox Sisters episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Kate was also outspoken about her beliefs, giving public lectures on free love and spiritualism. For a small frontier community, she was, well, kind of controversial.
Which is so funny, because you're at the frontier, you're in a rather lawless society already, where, you know, everything is kind of not as it used to be back east.
Right, and a big mix
worse,
of people.
Over the Atlantic Ocean, yeah.
Yeah.
And still you're like the odd ones there.
Yeah. 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 The family's origins were shrouded in mystery. Apparently they were German immigrants, but no one really knows for sure where they had come from. And in a time where everyone knew everyone else's business, that alone was strange. They called themselves the Benders, but rumors swirled that maybe they weren't even related. Some said that Elvira had been married several times before, and she had a different last name, and it wasn't clear if John Jr. and Kate were actually siblings. Was this all a cover for something darker? When the Benders set up their small inn and general store along the Osage Trail, they claimed they wanted to serve travelers, but as we'll see, their idea of hospitality would be something rather sinister.
Sorry for interrupting, but we keep mentioning the Osage Trail, and I'm not sure if we made it clear enough what is meant by that. So the Osage Trail was one of the main routes through southeastern Kansas in the 19th century, and it played a really big role in the westward expansion. Settlers, traders, travelers, they would use this trail to move west, especially as Kansas and nearby territories opened up to new homesteads. And for many people, the Osage Trail was their path to a fresh start, a chance at land, or a chance at a little fortune out on the frontier. Now, the trail itself ran through Labette County, passing right by where the Benders set up their inn, which is a perfect location. If you want to have an inn or a store, you want it in a location like that, right?
Yeah.
This area was still mostly isolated without much in the way of regular towns or established shops, which made it tough for travelers. There were very few places to rest or resupply along the way, so when people saw an inn or a store, they would stop because of necessity, but also because of curiosity, because you wanted to maybe talk to somebody else after you've been alone for a week, 2 weeks on the trail and didn't meet anyone, right? The trail was named for the Osage Nation, which is a Native American tribe whose ancestral land spanned Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. And like many tribes in the area, the Osage had been forced to cede much of their land as settlers moved west. But the trail kept its name, a small reminder of the region's original inhabitants. Also, if you read Killers of the Flower Moon or watched the movie that came out last year, I think, then you know that in the 1920s, the Osage Nation in Oklahoma became incredibly wealthy from oil on their land. But unfortunately, this fortune attracted a wave of brutal murders as people plotted to steal their wealth. Dozens of Osage members were mysteriously killed or disappeared, And this led to an investigation by the absolutely newly formed FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. It's very interesting.
It is very interesting. That's probably an episode for a whole episode, that story, or 3.
At least 2.
At least.
3.
Yeah. So when the Benders set up their place, it was really just a simple cabin on the Kansas frontier. There was nothing fancy about it at all. Just a single room divided by a canvas curtain. In the front, they ran a small general store and a sort of rough inn for travelers. They'd offer basic supplies like canned goods, dried meat, sardines, and anything that might come in handy on a long journey.
Honestly, when I read about it for this episode, I imagine it a bit like Minnie's haberdashery from the movie The Hateful Eight, just maybe smaller, I guess.
Nice. That film was so much fun. That's the first time that I saw a film in the theater with an intermission. I keep imagining the original Oregon Trail game and how you'd have to stock up first and buy like wheat and corn and rope and yeah. But this was more than just supplies. You could grab a meal there, rest up for a bit, or even spend the night if you needed to and had the money. The layout was straightforward. You entered the front section where there was a table and chairs set up for guests. They stocked shelves with goods they could sell, so they served as the neighborhood store in a way. Although, as we said, the neighbors did find them a little odd. But for travelers, it was just another place to stop along the Osage Trail. They're not spending enough time with these people to get the ick, to be creeped out, right? In the back, behind that canvas curtain, was the family's private living area, their personal space, so nobody really went back there except the Benders. The inn felt very simple, very frontier, very rustic chic. It still had that bit of privacy for the family. And then we had Kate Bender's spiritualist work. Now, Kate, as we said, was by far the most sociable member of the family, and she claimed to be a psychic and healer. She even offered spiritual readings to curious travelers and locals alike. It was probably her charm, more than the inn or the store, that attracted a lot of their business. People were intrigued by her claims that she could communicate with spirits or provide healing for ailments. So in a way, they had a unique setup. A mix of a practical store, a place to rest for the night, and a little dose of the supernatural, if you wanted it.
Which was all the rave at the time, I think, the spiritualism movement and the supernatural.
Very in vogue, yes. She even placed ads in local newspapers to attract customers. There's one here, it says, is it P-R-O-F? Is it supposed to be professor? Professional.
Yeah. Professor.
Prof.
Don't you do that? That's typical in German. That's how we shorten professor.
But how is she a professor of anything?
She's not. She's probably also not able to heal people and communicate with the spirits. Let's be real here.
I mean, it's fine. Professor Miss Katie Bender can heal all sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases. Also, deaf and dumbness.
Being deaf is really frowned upon, apparently, because she has to mention it twice.
Twice. Residence 14 miles east of Independence, on the road from Independence to Osage Mission, 1.5 miles southeast of Nora Head Station. Katie Bender. June 18th, 1872. You have to admire the confidence.
She probably didn't have imposter syndrome.
No, that's what I'm saying. She had no problem posting this. I get anxious if someone literally says, "Oh, you have a podcast? Can you give me more information?" I'm like, "I'm so sorry. Here's my business card." So, to most travelers, this would look like an ordinary stop along the trail. A little strange, maybe, but for folks on the move, it was a convenient stop to take a break, restock, and then keep on going.
Well, some of them would certainly soon be going through hell, well, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Because, after a while, people along the Osage Trail started noticing a traveling pattern. Travelers would pass through, stay at the Bender's little inn, and simply vanish. At first, these disappearances went absolutely unnoticed. I mean, it's a frontier town. It wasn't unusual for people to drop out of sight. They could be heading west, they could be trying their luck in a new town, or simply finding a reason to start over somewhere else, or they could just, accidents happen on the trails. It was dangerous.
Yeah, things happen. All the snakes.
Yeah.
Dysentery, I played, anybody who played Oregon Trail knows of all the hazards. Even though we're not in that state, it's all the same in my brain. Frontier towns, frontier danger.
But as more people went missing, locals began connecting the dots a little bit, noticing that many of the missing had last been seen at the Bender Inn. And yet, despite those troubling patterns, no one dared to confront the Benders. And I guess people just didn't want to anger this family, or were just like, let's leave them to it, whatever. They had an odd, almost menacing aura about them, especially the patriarch of the family. He was considered to be rather scary. John Bender Sr., he was, as Annie said, intimidating enough to just look at, and he was a large man who barely spoke any English, and when he did, it was thickly accented and nearly impossible to understand, and the people described him as gruff and unwelcoming. If you want to be an innkeeper, you really want to be unwelcoming to people and really scare them off. That's the best.
That's the problematic aspect of things, isn't it? Because I can think of a lot of large people who speak almost no English and are really hard to understand, but they're lovely. And this guy is not.
Elvira was no better. As we said, she was called the she-devil of the inn. She was rude, she was unapproachable, with a particular hatred for children, which, again, odd, especially at the time. Still odd today, but yeah. Locals were skeptical, and the people found her harsh and frightening. And then, of course, Kate's fascination with spiritualism, that made people definitely nervous, and her tendency to bring up controversial topics like free love. I mean, it's still the 1870s. She could have been in the what was the name of the cult?
The Oneida sex cult.
Oneida, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Shout out to the new listener I just met at Home Goods, because we passed by some Oneida and I was explaining to Misty, my friend, about the sex cult, but I didn't realize someone was standing near me when I infobombed her, and so, hey. Sorry. Yeah. I'm sure she was just horrifying people left, right, and center. I'm sure she had a real hankering to head north and make silverware. She was like, let's go to upstate New York and have a lot of sex and make some silverware. And the frontier people were not chill at all about the free love cult with all the sex and public criticism and whatnot. They were like, how about you go and tell us how it was? Send us a postcard.
Yeah, and on top of everything, there were the rumors about the relationship with her brother, John Jr., Locals whispered that they might be closer than siblings ought to be, or that perhaps John Jr. wasn't even her brother at all. And really, no one could say for certain if Elvira and John Sr. were actually married or just pretending to be husband and wife. The whole family's backstory was murky at best, and it only fueled people's suspicions more and more.
So as you can see, the whole story is full of rumors and lore, and you know what? It's not going to get any better. Despite all the rumors and very unsettling suspicions about all of these missing people, no one had any concrete reason to accuse the Benders of anything. People were uneasy around them, yes, but the family mostly kept to themselves, and the Benders' little inn along the Osage Trail remained open, a place for weary travelers to stop, rest, and maybe experience a little bit of Kate's spiritual guidance. But the locals couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, and as the disappearances continued, so did the whispers. And by 1873, the rumors about missing travelers along the Osage Trail were becoming impossible to ignore. The local community, already wary of the Benders, was growing more anxious. But it was the disappearance of one particular man, Dr. William H. York, that finally pushed things to a breaking point. To understand why Dr. William York's disappearance was such a turning point, let's talk a little bit about who he was. Dr. York was born in 1840 in Illinois and was a well-known and well-respected physician with a reputation for kindness and dedication to his work. He was the kind of man who believed in helping others. He was always willing to go out of his way to visit patients, even in the roughest parts of the state. He had served as a doctor in the Union Army during the Civil War, so he was no stranger to hardship, and he'd seen his fair share of loss and suffering. Dr. York wasn't just a compassionate physician, he was part of a family with real influence. He was one of 3 brothers, each with their own role in Kansas society. One brother, Colonel Ed York, was a decorated Civil War veteran known for his strength and leadership on and off the battlefield. The other, Senator Alexander York, held a seat in the Kansas State Senate, giving the family a significant political presence. Together, they were a close-knit, determined group, and when Dr. York disappeared, his brothers weren't about to just let that slide as another frontier mystery.
When Dr. York set out on his journey along the Osage Trail, he was on his way back from visiting a patient. He'd gone out of his way, as usual, to provide care where it was needed, and he told his family about his route, assuring them he'd be back soon. But days passed, and there was no sign of him. His family, especially his brothers, knew something had to be wrong. Dr. York was reliable and not the kind to vanish or change plans without a word. Pretty quickly, the York brothers were convinced that foul play was involved. They understood the dangers of the Kansas frontier, but they also knew that their brother William was cautious and careful, and he was an experienced man. His sudden disappearance struck them as deeply suspicious, and the more they looked into it, the more unsettling stories they uncovered. Other travelers who had vanished on the same trail, always near the same area. And that's what brought them to Labette County to ask questions and demand answers about what had happened to their brother. That was something that the Bender family hadn't anticipated, that Dr. York wasn't just another name on the list of missing travelers. He was a well-respected doctor and a beloved member of the community. People knew him, they trusted him, and they valued his dedication, and his disappearance struck a nerve. Not just for his family, but for the whole community at large. And it was this loss that finally spurred the locals to action. Because the York family wasn't about to let William's disappearance go uninvestigated, and with the power of a senator behind them, they weren't going to be ignored. So with mounting pressure from the York family and growing fears within the community, locals finally organized a search party to investigate the area more thoroughly. They began by searching along the Osage Trail looking for any sign of Dr. York or the other missing travelers. And eventually attention turned to the Bender property. Given the family's strange behavior and the eerie rumors surrounding them, the community was all too willing to examine their homestead.
And wouldn't you know it, when the search party finally made their way to the Bender's Inn, it was abandoned. The family had vanished, leaving behind only a seemingly empty cabin. But let's rewind for a second. How were the Benders warned that they were about to be searched? Why did they disappear? What had happened? Well, what had happened was, on April 3rd, 1873, a party of local men rode up to the Benders family roadside inn, now wary of this creepy-ass family. They told them that they were looking for Dr. William H. York and asked the Bender family if they had seen or heard anything about him. And the Benders were like, nope, sorry, can't help ya.
No, the Benders were like 99999.
Nine. And they just pretended they knew nothing, pretended to be completely ignorant about the doctor's whereabouts. A few days later, a second group of men stopped by the inn with the same question, pressing the Benders for any information about Dr. York. The family gave the same answer. They knew nothing. But this second visit seemed to rattle them. The family, now realizing that people were becoming suspicious and weren't going to just let this drop, quickly hitched up the horses, packed up a few belongings, and left the inn in a hurry. They didn't even bother to take household items or furnishings, which is significant because it's not like there's an IKEA around the corner. They just vanished, leaving behind the inn, their garden, and unfortunately, their animals. Weeks passed, and on May 9th, 1873, another search party rode by the Benders' property. This time, they noticed the place looked deserted. The house was eerily quiet, and as they ventured around the back of the inn, they made a disturbing discovery. Several hogs and calves had died, clearly from thirst and hunger. The livestock, abandoned and left to fend for themselves, immediately raised red flags. Finally. It's the only reason we're mentioning the animal stuff is because that's what actually finally made the neighbors realize that there was a serious problem.
Yeah, because nobody would do that because it was value.
It was huge value.
The value behind it, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they'd have no trouble selling them. So it became really obvious that the Bender family had left in a hurry and had no plans to return.
Obviously, this was enough to prompt an official investigation. The search party gathered, determined to figure out what had happened, and as they combed through the Benders' property, they made their way into a small half-acre orchard right next to the house. And the ground was freshly plowed and harrowed, but something about it looked unusual. A heavy rain had just passed, and in one particular spot the soil had settled in a noticeable depression, and it was the size and shape of a grave.
Oh, that's never a good sign, is it?
No, never. You don't want to find that.
No.
And the search party thought so as well, and so they started to dig. And within moments they uncovered a badly decomposed body. And it didn't take long to identify the remains. It was indeed Dr. William H. York, the very man whose disappearance had set this investigation in motion. His skull was crushed and his throat had been slit, and the horrific discovery confirmed what many had feared: something unspeakable had been happening at the Bender Inn. But Dr. York was just the beginning. As the day wore on, the search party continued digging throughout the orchard, finding 7 more bodies. And there's a photo. We're gonna post it in the Facebook group. Each one of the bodies they found told a similar story: a crushed skull and a throat slit ear to ear. The victims were identified as people who had passed through the area in recent months, individuals who had likely stopped at the Bender Inn for a meal or a place to rest. Among the victims was, for example, W.F. McCroddy, a resident of Cedarville who had been in town contesting a case at the land office. He likely stopped at the inn on his way home. Then there was a D. Brown, also from Cedarville. He had been trading horses in the area, and Brown's body was so decomposed it was barely recognizable, but he was identified by a silver ring he wore, which I find a little bit weird that the murderers didn't take the ring, right?
I think maybe money wasn't the motive, or maybe taking belongings in a place like this. It's not like they're in New York City where they can just run to a pawn shop, right? Like, how are they going to sell belongings without potentially creating?
You think they were more after the money?
I don't know.
From what I read, the greed was the number one motivation, but not the only, apparently.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it was the only motivation. Yeah. I think they enjoyed it, or they wouldn't have kept it up. I just think some belongings would be too easily traceable, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
You know, like if it was a signet ring or something that he wore, and they were able to identify him by the fact that he had this ring on, then it could also be a situation where if they tried to sell it, somebody might say, but this belongs to so-and-so.
I wonder what they did with the horses and the wagons.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if they sold them to other travelers. But wouldn't that
also be like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Maybe people just didn't ask questions. There's so many questions in this case.
That's true. And so little answers and yeah. Another victim was identified as Henry F. McKenzie, a man from Indiana who had been missing since the previous December, and he was last seen traveling to Independence, Kansas, with plans to settle there. His sister, Mrs. J. Thompson, later identified him by his clothing. Then there were the bodies of Mr. Longower and his baby girl. They were also found. Longower had been a widower on his way to Iowa after burying his wife the previous year. His daughter's death was particularly horrible. She had no injuries, which suggested that she might have just been thrown into the grave alive to her father's body and then just buried alive.
Horrifying. 2 additional bodies were found but remained unidentified. Possibly more unlucky travelers who had stopped at the Bender Inn, never to be seen again. And then in a final heartbreaking discovery, the search party unearthed the body of another child. Based on her size and long golden hair, it was believed she might have been around 8 years old. Her body was brutally mangled, her breastbone shattered, her leg twisted and jammed beneath her. Once the bodies were uncovered, the men turned to the house itself. Stepping inside, they were immediately met with an overwhelming stench, a rancid, choking odor that seeped through every corner of the inn. As they examined the main room, they noticed the peculiar setup, the cloth partition hanging across the room, forming a small booth where guests would sit and eat. The table was positioned right up against this partition so that anyone seated there would have their back to the curtain. Behind the curtain, they found the instruments of the Benders' brutal trade. There were 2 stone-breaker hammers lying on the floor, heavy and blood-stained. The scene made it clear how the Benders had operated. They would invite their guests to sit at the table, and once seated, the back of the guest's head would press the cloth partition. On the other side, one or both of the men, John Sr. or John Jr., would lie in wait with a hammer, ready to strike when the opportunity presented itself. A quick blow to the head would stun or kill the victim instantly.
They must have been really good at washing out blood stains from sheets.
So good. But the horror didn't end there. Underneath the table, the search party found a trap door leading to a dark, 6-foot-deep pit. The Benders had dug this pit as a holding area for bodies. After knocking their victims unconscious, they would slide them down through the trap door into the pit. Once inside, the victim's throat would be cut to ensure they were dead, likely to silence any last signs of life. Over time, congealed blood had collected in the pit, causing the unbearable stench that greeted the searchers. It's like what the people at the Amityville house wanted you to believe was in the basement.
Yeah, true. It also feels like a very basic H.H. Holmes setup with the trapdoor.
It does, doesn't it?
And I know they say that the whole murder mansion hotel thingy was not even that,
It's been blown out of proportion.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I was thinking about with the trapdoor and the bodies just thrown down there.
I kept thinking of, oh my God, I'm going to draw a blank now. Is it not BTK. Sorry, the migraine is approaching. The guy that used to dress up as a clown and buried all the bodies in his, under the house.
John Wayne Gacy.
Thank you, my God. It reminds me of John Wayne Gacy. Yeah, with the burying of bodies underneath.
Yeah,
in the crawl
space.
Oh, yeah, I just don't like any of it. So then once night would fall, the Benders would come out and bury their victims, take them out of the pit, and bury them in the orchard, carefully plowing and harrowing the ground to hide any kind of evidence that another grave had been dug. This practice of repeatedly plowing the soil helped to disguise the entire burial situation. It disguised the graves and ensured that nobody noticed anything out of place. The neighbors, now realizing the extent of these atrocities, were absolutely furious. Vigilante groups were organized. They were just determined to track down the Benders and bring them to justice. A mile down the road, there was a grocery store run by Brockman, a supposed old friend of John Bender Sr., and a former business partner. Brockman was immediately suspected of either helping with the murders or at least knowing what the Benders had been up to. Desperate for information, a group of men grabbed Brockman, dragged him to a wooded area miles from town, and tried to exact a confession from him. They put a rope around his neck, threatening to hang him if he didn't reveal what he knew. But Brockman pleaded for mercy, insisting he had no knowledge of the Benders' crimes. They hanged him, let him dangle just long enough to scare him before cutting him down. Still, he refused to confess, swearing his innocence. This brutal questioning was repeated 2 more times, but Brockman continued to deny any involvement, and eventually the men gave up, leaving him alive but barely conscious.
Meanwhile, back at the Bender property, more evidence surfaced. Locals recalled finding a man's body in Drum Creek not long before the search of the Benders' orchard, and his skull had been crushed just like the other victims. And after further investigation, they discovered wagon trails leading from the creek to the Bender property, the wheels leaving a peculiar zigzag trail in the ground. The tracks matched those left by the Benders' wagon, and so it became pretty clear and pretty obvious that this was another Bender victim, and that possibly many more were waiting to be discovered. They don't know where the Benders came from, what they did before, where they went. You know what I mean? There could have been so many more victims. And I do think this is a good moment to stop for this week. And next week we'll tell you how it all ended, if it even ended, if there were maybe survivors. and all of the aftermath and mystery that surrounds this case.
That's right. There's a lot to unpack here. All right. Looking forward to next week.
Do you have something good?
I do have something good. So when we were researching this and talking about the land grab, and the Homestead Act in 1862, it reminded me of the 1992 film Far and Away, directed by Ron Howard, starring Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. In the movie, I think she looks the prettiest in, which is a very shallow thing to say. 15-year-old
I
me
love that movie.
Thought it was the most romantic. I mean, I had no idea how romantic the Oklahoma land race was. The Irish famine.
And it was before we knew all about Tom Cruise and his craziness.
Yeah.
I love that movie. Now I want to rewatch it. I watched it so many times as a teenager.
Me too. Should we rewatch it as adults just to see if it's still good or bad and do like a thing?
I'm sure it's still good. I'm sure it still holds up.
Oh. She looks so pretty when she's riding her horse. Do you have something good? Or are you also doing Far and Away? Is that just our shared something good from our childhood, from our teenage years?
Just like you, when I was reading up on the Benders, I was thinking a lot about that movie.
Yeah. All I could think about was Far and Away. And I have the Enya song in my head.
Oh,
God,
yeah.
I love that movie. And then he becomes a boxer. Oh.
And she's gutting fish in the factory.
That's right, in Boston.
The rich girl.
I know, that poor little rich girl.
Yeah. She just ran away with him.
She just runs off after trying to stab him in the thigh with a pitchfork. When they're racing those horses. Oh, God, so romantic. All right, we're going to rewatch Far and Away.
Yeah, let's do that. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please do us the huge favor, and we mean it, leave us a rating and or review on your podcast app. Somehow, always reviews are disappearing. Like, I always see the reviews and then they're gone again. I don't know what's with that.
I don't either.
Check out our Patreon. As we told you, we had this change where we do Patreon on, like, live streams on YouTube for our Patreon members, and then you can rewatch them if you don't have time. But we're also gonna add to that the 30-minute, 20 minutes live get-together on Discord so that we can discuss with you in person things that you want to discuss. So that's gonna be fun and a new addition. And our next get-together will be in December, and I think after Christmas, right? Before New Year.
Yes. Yes.
Like 29th, something like that?
Yeah, I think so. Does that work for our listeners? That can be a tough week because kids are home from school and a lot of people are traveling between Christmas and New Year's.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
You let us know. If you're in our Patreon group, just pop in and let us know what December
I gonna make a post
like.
if it's better to do it before New Year or after New Year.
Yeah.
And join our Facebook group. And yeah, that's it.
That's right.
Tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, feed them, give them water.
That's right.
Treat them kindly. Be kind to your fellow human being. And the most important and hardest part of it all, well, not the most important, but also an important part of your life should be kind to yourself.
That's right. Even if you're the worst. Just be nicer to yourself if you could. And just remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.